Your personality reflects your unique response to your environment. It is part of your identity and your sense of self. Although you change over time, the ways that you interact with the world and cope with events are pretty much set by the end of adolescence. Some people's identities cause them to interact with the world in maladaptive and inflexible ways. When this style of interaction is long-lasting and causes problems in work and social situations, it becomes a personality disorder. Although people with personality disorders do not individual, family and friends, and society. Your sense of self is how you view your own personality and is usually consistent. That is, you experience yourself in generally the same way, although situations may bring out different aspects of yourself. In dissociative disorders, a person's normal sense of self becomes disrupted or even fractured into multiple selves. The following section is about two disorders of self: personality disorders and dissociative disorders. The DSM-5 divides personality disorders into three groups. Disorders in the first group, which is called Cluster A, are characterized by odd or eccentric behavior. People with paranoid, schizoid, or schizotypal personality disorders are often reclusive and suspicious. They have difficulty forming personal relationships because of their strange behavior and aloofness. As you might expect, people with personality disorders in this category show some similarities to people with schizophrenia, but their symptoms are far less severe. Disorders in the second group, which is called Cluster B, are characterized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviors. Antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders make up this group. Borderline and antisocial personality disorders have been the focus of much research, so they're discussed in more detail on the next slide. Disorders in the third group, which is known as Cluster C, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders, are characterized by anxious or fearful behavior. These disorders share some characteristics of anxiety disorders, such as social phobia or generalized anxiety disorder. However, personality disorders in this third group refer more to maladaptive ways of interacting with others and of responding to events. People with obsessive-compulsive disorder have true obsessions and compulsions, but people with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder do not. For instance, whereas people with OCD may be obsessed with germs and have a compulsion to wash their hands, people with an obsessive-compulsive personality disorder may be excessively neat and orderly. They might always eat the same food at precisely the same time, or perhaps read a newspaper in a particular order each time. People with OCD are often distressed by their rituals. By contrast, people with personality disorders view their behaviors as problematic only when it interferes with their lives. For example, people with personality disorders may find it impossible to travel or maintain relationships. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by disturbances in identity, in emotional states, and in impulse control. This complex disorder was officially recognized as a diagnosis in 1980. The term borderline was initially used because people with these disorders were considered on the border between normal and psychotic. Approximately 1 to 2% of adults meet the criteria for borderline personality disorder, and the disorder is more than twice as common in women as in men. People with borderline personality disorder seem to lack a strong sense of self. They cannot tolerate being alone and have an intense fear of abandonment. Because they desperately need an exclusive and dependent relationship with another person, they can be very manipulative in their attempts to control relationships. In addition to problems with identity, borderline individuals have affective disturbances. Emotional instability is a key feature. Episodes of depression, anxiety, anger, irritability, or some combination of these states can last from a few hours to a few days, and shifts from one mood to another usually occur for no obvious reason. A third key feature of borderline personality disorder is impulsivity, which may explain the much higher rate of the disorder in prisons than in the general population. Impulsivity can include physical fighting, binge eating, purging, and self-mutilation, such as cutting and burning of the skin, is commonly associated with this disorder, as is a high risk for suicide. Those with borderline personality disorder show abnormal functioning of the frontal lobes, which are important for controlling behavior. Borderline personality disorder may have an environmental component because of the strong relationship that exists between the disorder and trauma or abuse. Some studies have reported that 70 to 80% of patients with borderline personality disorder have experienced physical or sexual abuse or observed some kind of extreme violence. Other theories propose that borderline patients may have had caretakers who did not accept them or were unreliable or unavailable. The constant rejection and criticism made it difficult for the patients to learn to regulate their emotions and understand emotional reactions to events. An alternative theory is that caregivers encourage dependence, preventing the individuals in their charge from adequately developing a sense of self. As a result, the individuals became overly sensitive to others' reactions. If rejected by others, they reject themselves. During the 1970s, a handsome and charismatic law student named Ted Bundy kidnapped, raped, and murdered 30 or more young women and girls and violated their bodies in appalling ways. Most people can't understand Bundy's behavior. Even one of Bundy's defense attorneys described him as heartless and evil, and Bundy was eventually executed for his crimes. According to the DSM-5, antisocial personality disorder, or APD, is the diagnosis for individuals who behave in socially undesirable ways, such as breaking the law and being deceitful and irresponsible. People with APD are willing to take advantage of others and hurt them without showing any concern or remorse for their behavior. Instead, people with this disorder tend to be focused on pleasure, seeking immediate gratification of wants and needs with no thought about others. For example, such individuals could be superficially charming and rational, but they could also be insincere, unsocial, and incapable of love, lack insight, and be shameless. However, not all criminals can be described as having APD. In the United States, about 1 to 4% of the population has APD. APD is much more common in men than in women. The disorder is most apparent in late adolescence and early adulthood, and people who have this disorder generally improve on their own around age 40. Various psychological abnormalities may play a role in APD. In 1957, David Lycan reported that those with APD do not become anxious when they experience unpleasant stimuli. Lycan and other investigators have continued this line of research, showing that such individuals do not seem to feel fear or anxiety. They do not learn from punishment because they do not experience punishment as particularly unpleasant. This pattern of reduced psychophysiological response in the face of punishment also occurs in adolescents at risk for developing APD. Abnormalities in multiple brain regions involved in responding to fear and controlling impulses have been found in those with APD or whose behavior in adolescence places them at risk for developing APD. Sometimes you may get lost in your thoughts or daydreams, even to the point of losing track of what is going on around you. Maybe you have had the experience of forgetting what you're doing while in the middle of an action. Why was I headed to the kitchen? When you wake up in an unfamiliar location, you may be disoriented for a short time and not know where you are. In other words, your thoughts and experiences can become dissociated or split from the external world. Dissociative disorders are extreme versions of this phenomenon. These disorders involve disruptions of identity, memory, or conscious awareness. In all of them, some parts of memory are split off from a person's conscious awareness. Dissociative disorders are believed to result from extreme stress. That is, the person with a dissociative disorder has split off a traumatic event in order to protect the person's sense of self. Some researchers believe that people prone to dissociative disorders are also prone to PTSD. In dissociative amnesia, a person forgets that an event happened or loses awareness of a large block of time. For example, someone with this disorder may suddenly lose memory for personal facts, including a person's own name and address. These memory failures cannot be accounted for by ordinary forgetting, such as briefly forgetting where you parked your car, or by the effects of drugs or alcohol. Consider the case of Dorothy Judry from Calgary, Canada. In 1995, after suffering years of physical abuse from her husband, Judry shot him 6 times. Her husband survived, and he described her behavior during the shooting as very calm, as if she were detached from what she was doing. When the police arrived, however, Judry was extremely distraught. She had no memory of the shooting and told police that she simply found her husband shot and lying in the garage floor, at which time she called for help. Judry was found not criminally responsible for her actions because of her dissociative state. The rarest and most extreme form of dissociative amnesia is dissociative fugue. The disorder involves a loss of identity. In addition, it involves traveling to another location and sometimes assuming a new identity there. The fugue state often ends suddenly, leaving people unsure of how they ended up in unfamiliar surroundings. Typically, they do not remember events that took place during the fugue state. An individual with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, has developed 2 or more distinct identities. The condition was formally called multiple personality disorder. Most people diagnosed with DID are women who report being severely abused as children. According to the most common theory, children who are likely to develop DID cope with abuse by pretending it is happening to someone else. They enter a trance-like state in which they separate their mental states from their physical bodies. Over time, this dissociated state takes on its own identity. Different identities develop to deal with different traumas. Often the identities have periods of amnesia, and sometimes only one identity is aware of the others. Indeed, diagnosis often occurs only when a person has difficulty accounting for large chunks of time. The separate identities usually differ substantially in gender, sexual orientation, age, language spoken, interests, physiological profiles, and patterns of brain activation. Even their handwriting can differ. Despite this evidence, many researchers remain skeptical about whether or not DID is a genuine psychological disorder or even whether it exists at all. In part, they have doubts because DID first received popular attention when it was portrayed in the 1976 movie Sybil. After the movie, there was a sharp rise in reported cases. Therapists in the 1980s and 1990s who used hypnosis were the most likely to diagnose their clients as having DID. Skeptics claim that it was the therapist's beliefs that led to the increased diagnoses. Moreover, some people may have hidden motives for claiming DID. A diagnosis of DID often occurs after someone has been accused of committing a crime, raising the possibility that the subject is pretending to have multiple identities to avoid conviction. Ultimately, how can we know whether a diagnosis of DID is valid? Most often, there's no objective, definitive test for diagnosing a psychological disorder. It can be difficult to tell if a person is faking, has come to believe what a therapist said, or has a genuine psychological disorder.